there's two big questions, I think. One is, how does the No campaign manage a negative campaign? Because you can do negative and then you can do negative. So you can play a semi-positive, but really the undercurrents are negative, and saying, we've got something good here. Don't risk it. Now that's a negative campaign with a positive veneer. Now if they run that can work for them. But I think, and I don't usually say this, but I think Durwood, the guy who was behind the Scottish People's Alliance year ago, I think it was Scotland and Sunday a couple of weeks ago, he's No campaign, and he's worried that they're being too negative. And I think he may be right. If they keep going with this, and I agree, I think Alex's word exactly right, there's tones of scorched earth in some of the things that they're saying. And I mean, I've got to say that I can't remember which one it was. I think it was one of the committees, and I think it was Lords, who suggested that an independent Scotland might end up being bombed by Westminster if Westminster wasn't happy about how they were handling terrorists.
You've just ruined one of my questions for the quiz.
Oh, shite. Well, I knew that one was bound to come up, because that's been the most...
Is it the Lord Fraser, is it, of Carmiley?
I think it was. I can't remember. But that was the most crazy thing that's been said so far.
It's astonishing to think of this.
It's just a daft thing for someone to have said. Yeah. So that's the challenge for the No campaign, is how do they keep a positive veneer, and what has to be, and I'm not criticising them for this, it has to be a basically negative campaign to get a no. The much more difficult question is, well, actually, I don't think this is true, but the more complex question is how the Yes campaign runs a positive yes. Now, this is what I think is complicated at the moment, because they need to come up with a vision, they need to come up with a story. The SNP at the moment appears kind of petrified. It's almost as if they're scared to tell a story, and I should probably explain that. If you want to take someone from here to yes, the only thing that takes you from here to a yes is a story, a narrative, something that explains why you should bridge that gap. It's almost as if they're scared to come out with a story just in case they've got the wrong one. It's almost like they're sitting around a table saying, I've thought up a story, better not chance it just yet. We'll work out what the story is. But you can't keep this going indefinitely. They need to work out what their story is.
Well, you're the strategist, but if it was me, I would be using all of them coming out on all platforms at all times.
That's kind of my basic argument, incidentally. What I've said is that the success for the Yes campaign, and I've argued this quite a bit, success for the Yes campaign comes in allowing the people within the Yes campaign, the broader Yes campaign, to argue. Now, I've said this quite a bit, that the most successful way for the Yes campaign to achieve things is if I can be arguing with somebody who's from the right of the political spectrum, and I can say, I support independence because we could do this. And the other side says, and we support independence because we could do this. And we say, now we don't agree, but what we agree is these are things that are possible with independence that wouldn't otherwise be possible. My view is that the SNP can relax a bit, stop trying to clamp down in the debate, stop trying to be scared about because somebody's got Republican Socialist in the name of their movement, or because another group might seem to be too far to the right, or doesn't sit with the rest of the independence campaign. They've got to relax about this. They've got to allow the campaign not to be about a portfolio of policies, but an interplay of ideas. Now, that's how I think they want to do it, along with just getting some stuff right. I'm sure at some point we're going to come on to EU debacle. They've got to fix their messes. Now, that's just straightforward. You've got to fix your messes. Just like, and again, I suspect we'll come back onto this again, just like the Labour Party has realised it cannot be undifferentiated within a No campaign because it's damaging for them. So apparently Anis Sarwar is going to come out with a Labour campaign which is pro-union and pro-redistribution of wealth. Now, that I'm going to look forward to seeing how you square. But nevertheless, I think people are realising that there's changes coming.
Okay, maybe that's actually an interesting point there, to just stray a little bit towards the right end of the political spectrum. Because one thing which I think is a story which is emerging is this broad feeling that the pro-independence argument will be left inflected politically. It's quite, in fact, common. I think I saw Yes Scotland doing it even this week, to say, for example, vote yes to protect free higher education in universities, which suggests quite an interesting question.
Somebody has to pay for it. The argument is over who it is that pays for it.
Yeah, but it's sort of what seems to me a bit funny is, say that you were somebody who felt that no tuition fees, no graduate taxation, whatever, was a bad idea. What argument is that coming to you from the Yes Scotland campaign about why you should support independence? And I think that touches on this fundamental question about, well, is it going to be a kind of left coalition arguing to try and unite a kind of SNP vote and a Labour vote to achieve a majority for independence? Or is it going to be the sort of thing Robin's envisaging, which is less fierce, I suppose, about having a chat? Maybe, I mean, Alex, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, because
I agree with a lot of what Robin's just been saying. I think that it would be very good for the SNP to be a bit more relaxed about these things and to sort of say that, yes, the independence campaign is not the same as the campaign for the first elections after independence. I think at the moment, however, what you see is that the SNP are absolutely obsessed with targeting Labour supporters in the west of Scotland. And now that's absolutely fine. There are lots of them, after all. They're a crucial part of the electorate, but they are not the whole of the electorate. And at the moment, I think that the SNP's lurch to the left on a lot of issues, to some extent, means that they are not talking to the whole of Scotland. If there are many Scotlands, the SNP are not talking to all that many of them. I think that you have this oddly negative campaign for independence a lot of the time. Vote for independence and there'll never be another Margaret Thatcher. Vote for independence to keep things in terms of the National Health Service or education as they are. Not because they will be radically transformed post-independence, but just to keep them as they are and protect them from the ravages of a heartless Conservative-led government in London. That is actually a negative campaign for independence. And it is also a pinched and crabby argument that is in its own way actually feared. It's not a case for a sort of broader, more expansive Scotland in the future. I think Robin's absolutely right that, yes, let's have this argument about, left and right within the independence movement. I think that would be much healthier. I think it would demonstrate a degree of confidence and intellectual muscle and flexibility, perhaps, that the SNP presently lacks. I think you have a very centralised, very command. The party is, of course, in general interested in centralising Scottish politics, which I think is a deplorable trend, but one that at present is it seems to be irreversible. Not least
on why the SNP seems to behave in this way, and one of the things I think which would be relatively undeniable about this is the press and the emergence of sort of debate is something which I find that journalists quite often pathologise in a strange way. Sorry, Alex.
Arguing amongst themselves and so on, then the talk would be, yes, SNP riven with division. How can this party be trusted when they don't even agree amongst themselves about what independence should mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, yes, I can see the difficulties for that, obviously, but at the same time, you cannot run a campaign based upon your fear of how stupid the Daily Record is.
No, that's true. I mean, I'd sympathise with that.
It's not fear; it's dismay.
But why? Something which I have often wondered about. Why do journalists in Scotland? It's not just the Daily Mail. I mean, you get it all over the place. Before the Radical Independence Conference, Hamish MacDonald had an astonishing piece in the Independent of all places about how this was a disaster for Salmond. I wonder, why do you think that Scottish journalists are so so they find the idea of a broad debate so disturbing? And so challenging.
It's a simple answer. Story. I mean, not very clever, but I suppose.
There's damaging admission from Massie there.
The media issue, I think, is a particularly complicated one just now, and this is really strange. I find myself in the strangest position. I find myself defending politicians half the time to people who say, "Oh, they're all crooks." No, they're not. That's not fair. And I spend an enormous amount of time defending journalists to people, particularly on the left. And a lot of the time, I keep wanting to say to people on the left, look, stop moaning that they didn't run your story if you didn't pick up a phone. Did you pick up a phone and speak to a journalist? No, well, don't moan at the fact that they didn't run your story if you don't do the things that they do. So I've spent an enormous amount of time defending journalists over in this direction. It's just a job. We know the politics of the Daily Mail. There's no point in complaining about it. I've been disappointed about some of the things that have happened, but this is what I would say. I would say that we have a problem with the media in Scotland, and there's the breadth of the range of the problems is so great that it's hard to even talk about it just now. But for one thing, there's about 6 people writing each of the main newspapers in Scotland now, certainly the broadsheets. I mean, there's a tiny number of journalists working on them. And
that's not so much a problem of journalism. That's a problem with the public.
As well, they're not buying newspapers.
Journalism, you've got to buy it. You've got to purchase newspapers.
But let me put it this way: it's a problem. It's a problem for journalists because, again, just to pick the examples that I mentioned before, if something doesn't come from the leadership of a political party or from a small number of sources within that party, it's completely missed. It's completely not seen. So, for example, I mean, I was quite involved in the anti-NATO campaign, and I was saying to people early on, if anyone tells you that they know this is won, they're wrong. And people were saying, we expect this to go 80-20. Yes, it's not going to be 80-20. I know, because I've heard some of the stuff from the grassroots. In the end, it went 48-52. Now, what I'm saying by this is, first of all, the journalists are very distant from large parts of politics now. And that's one of the problems. And what this has meant is we now have a kind of narrative-driven political campaign. Certain things are in the narrative and certain things aren't. So, for example, this week we've seen the Centre for Public Policy in the Regions producing a report which makes front page splash in the Herald. Now, has anyone seen this report? Because it's not published on their website. I've got information which says that it wasn't really properly supported by the person that did the source data, and so on and so on. Now, I run a left-wing think tank. We've actually got stronger governance structures than the Centre for Public Policy in the Regions, which is really just a blog. But we wouldn't be able to put out a story because the narrative is blow to. So the narrative at the moment is blow to yes campaign is the story that's running. Anything that looks like a blow for yes is in the political narrative. Now, some of this is editorial judgment, and some of it is just the natural process of the no campaign has taken a much firmer grip of deciding what the shape of the story is. So, for example, as I keep pointing out, the no campaign keeps expecting the yes campaign to describe what currency we will be using in 5 years in Scotland. But nobody's, for example, saying, well, if we stay in the Union, will we invade Iran? So they've managed to turn the narrative of the stories round in such a way that it's flowing in one direction. And that's where the phrase spin came from originally. But, and this is the thing, I don't think it can sustain in the way it's going just now. Because, to pick up on an earlier point, this is now getting a little bit complicated and confused from my arguments. But while I would like to see a broad debate within the Yes campaign, and I think it is the right way to go, nevertheless, if you're going to be calm and clear-headed and say, what are you targeting? What are you trying to do with the Yes campaign? The answer is that most of the voters that need to be moved are kind of left of centre. So there is this issue to do with how can you capture a narrative back from the media which is connecting with the groups that you need to speak to, and it's not impossible, but it's not easy. It's not straightforward. So I've got to say, I am becoming... I don't say this often, and I really don't. I try not to moan about the media. It's people doing a job. But in the last couple of months, I've found the reporting has become, to me, hard to understand. I usually just suck up bad news when I know it's bad news.
It's that sanguine in the face of.
I mean, let me give a specific example. For the first time in probably 10 years, I actually pinged off some emails to journalist contacts of mine saying, "Come on, what the hell was that?" Now I never do that. I have no patience for that generally, but I can suck up every negative story about independence running in the newspapers, and then I wake up in the morning and the IFS, which is probably the most well-regarded, well-respected independent think tank in Britain in terms of kind of fiscal matters and straightforward matters, it comes out with a report that says Scotland would be better off if it was independent. Now that was, again, I was a journalist. That's the straightforward headline that came out of that, and somehow the media managed to pull out a bit further on which says, but in 30 years' time when the oil runs out, there might be a bit of a problem. Now, I say again, from my perspective, I will suck up all the bad stories, but that was a nail-on positive story for yes. Yes, Scotland would be better off says the IFS if it was independent, and it wasn't run like that. So I do think there are going to be some severe difficulties for the Yes campaign if that sort of story isn't being run like that, and I do have some concerns. But and
maybe I could just sort of bring Alex back in there, and maybe ask Alex a question which I've often wanted to ask him. So since you're here, I might as well avail myself of the opportunity. Which is, you are, I think it's fair to say, a kind of right of centre fella with kind of libertarian leanings, and you are, interestingly, in terms of Scottish political commentary, undecided really about and persuadable about the independence question.